Welcome to Extra Credits. Today we will be looking at the Preferences window. I know it's not super exciting, but it does contain a lot of different options that you can adjust that will suit the way that you use live. Adjust your audio input and output settings, MIDI, the look and feel of the program itself, just a lot of the general functionality, location of your plugins. Let's dive into it. You can use the hotkeys Control comma on a PC, which brings it up, or you can also go up to Options Preferences on PC or Live Preferences on Mac. So you'll notice there's a bunch of tabs on the left here that separate the different sections of options. So we'll just go through them one by one. At the very, very top, you got look and feel. Language, where you select your language. Do not show again warnings, just for any of the tooltips that pop up occasionally when you're first starting up live. If you want to see all of those things again, you can just hit restore. Follow behavior. If you've set live to follow, meaning that wherever the playhead is, live will keep your screen focused on it in arrangement view. You've got a couple of options on how it functions like that. It can either scroll smoothly as the playhead moves, or if you change it to page, it will jump by a page. So it'll wait for the playhead to go from all the way left to all the way right, then jump to the next page. Hide labels is just a way of cleaning up the session view. I'll show you really quickly. It's these little labels right here. If you hide them, they just go away. Not super helpful, but if you've got a cluttered screen, it can clean things up. And if you know what's going on over here already, you probably don't need those labels. Sleep mode, automatically live will disable sleep mode. But for whatever reason, if you want to let your computer go to sleep, then you can tell it to go to sleep. I would pretty much always leave that off. Allow multiple instances. If you feel the need to open more than one live window at the same time, you can turn this on. One thing that you should note about it, though, is the second instance will not have anything propagated in the browser over here, which can be a little bit frustrating. But if you need to, say, copy some clips from one session to another, or if you're building an alternate session from one that already exists, it's a way of doing that. Permanent scrub areas turns on a section in the arrangement view and clip view where you can easily jump to a point in time in playback. I usually leave that on because it can be handy, especially if you have a long sample or clip. You can very easily jump forward in it. Pen tablet mode. This is only really applicable if you're using a screen where you would use a pen. Enable high DPI mode basically just allows Live's interface here to look a little bit nicer, especially on high resolution screens. It can cause problems with third-party plugins. I haven't personally experienced any. If you do turn it off or on, it does mean you have to restart Live, though. Zoom display. This can be exceptionally handy. Just depending upon your eyesight and how much you're trying to fit on the screen, you can see as you zoom, it scales everything up, or you can zoom out so that you can fit more on the screen. And you can arrow up, down, or drag it to taste. Now we move on to the track and clip colors section. So when you make a new clip, if auto assign track colors is set to off, then you can have every new track default to this color right here. If it's on, it will randomly assign the colors. Clip color determines how making new clips are assigned a color. If it's set to track color, it will automatically be whatever color that track is set to, or it can be set to random and it'll just select any random color every time you make a new clip, just so you can see how it functions. If it's set to track color, if I make a new MIDI clip, it's yellow, another one yellow, another one yellow, another one yellow. This can be handy for keeping track of a track specifically, especially in arrangement view. Sometimes you might want to change clips in the same track different colors for different sections, like your verses might be yellow and your choruses might be green, however you want to set that up. Moving on, we have the colors section, and this determines what the actual live interface looks like. There's a few themes that you can choose from that will adjust the overall color of everything. But you also have the ability to adjust that here. So your brightness determines the overall brightness, as you might imagine. But then you can also change the colors by adjusting color intensity. So if I put this up to 100%, you can see now I'm sort of this blue-green color. But by changing color hue, you can kind of cycle through the whole rainbow of colors to find a combination that you like. You can also find some pretty ugly ones. And this applies to all of the different themes as well. As you can see, there's sort of a general gist of the theme, but you can kind of change the overall feel of it, which is kind of nice. Plugin windows has to do with third-party plugins. If you have multiple plugins set to on, you can view several of them at the same time. This might be handy if you're using a couple of different instruments like soft synths, or if you have a chain of third-party plugin effects on a track. Auto hide plugin windows will show you only plugins that are on your currently selected track, so you don't get too many screens popping up and filling up your workspace. That can be handy just so you can focus on what you need to look at any particular time. An auto open plugin custom editor will just go straight to the plugin screen as soon as you add it to a new track, so you can see what preset is loaded, see what the settings are on it. You can easily close it again after it opens. I like to have that just to verify that the plugin actually opened. Now, moving on to the audio tab. This is going to be very important because if this isn't correctly set up, you won't hear anything. So let's take a look at a few of the different sections. So your audio device is your audio interface, whatever it may be. There's a few different driver types. On PC, you have MME DirectX and ASIO. This is usually if you have just an internal sound card, nothing special, it's usually going to fall in this category. A lot of laptops, same thing. If you have an external audio interface, it's going to function the best with ASIO drivers. What that basically means is it's specialized computer drivers to tell your computer how to interface with this extra piece of hardware. And it allows for much lower latency time with the audio and MIDI. So what that translates to is it's a lot easier to record new things in when what you're hearing is what's happening as you play it or sing it. If there's latency, you'll hear a delay between when you hit a key or when you sing something in the microphone and when you actually hear it. And that can make it very difficult to play along with something that's already in there. So for audio device, in this situation, I'm selecting my Motu. And you have input and output configuration options. So on the input configuration, these are all possible mono inputs and possible stereo inputs from my interface. Sometimes it can be confusing as far as how Live sees an input, a physical input, and what numbers it assigns to it. It may take a little bit of experimenting to find what corresponds with what within Live. But now they allow you to actually name the input channels, which is very, very convenient for finding things later on. So in this case, I have 2 stereo pairs and 4 mono inputs selected. We'll just go to the screen here. So on an input track here, you can see they come up with their names, which is very, very nice. So if I wanted to select, for instance, this is my vocal input right here. This is the microphone input channel. So it's very easy to find, once you've labeled things, find what you're actually looking for instead of just a list of numbers. You don't have to try to remember where things are. So the same goes for outputs. Same deal. You may have to look through some of your interface's documentation or stumble through its settings pages to figure out which input corresponds with which physical input on the device. But again, you can name things, which is very nice. Hardware setup is just a quick link to go to your interface's preferences. So if you have a external interface, a lot of times there will be a program that controls interface dependent settings. So sometimes it can be routing inputs and outputs. It can be monitoring. This will just take you right to your interface's setup page. Moving on to the sample rate. This is the rate the audio is recorded in and played back at. What that means in practical terms is it's the amount of ones and zeros crammed into your audio files. The higher the number is, the better the audio quality. However, you also got to keep in mind that you're probably going to be bouncing this down eventually to 44.1. That's standard CD quality, or 48. Either one of those is probably where you're going to end up before you lower the quality even further and make it an MP3. If you want to raise this to higher numbers, the audio quality will be higher, but it's a lot more taxing on your computer. So you may not be able to play as many simultaneous audio tracks. You may have more latency. Usually I'll keep it at 44.1 or 48, unless I have some higher quality recordings from somewhere else. And then I may end up bouncing it down to a lower sample rate later on. Default sample rate and pitch conversion. I have this set to high quality by default. It can also be on normal. High quality just means that when audio is being time stretched or pitch shifted, it uses a better algorithm to do all of that work. It will sound better, especially if you're making more extreme adjustments, slowing things way down, speeding them way up, pitch shifting them higher or low or amounts. Now, looking at the latency section, this is important to pay attention to. Down here, you have a calculation of your overall latency. So mine is 19.6 milliseconds. That's pretty decent. The lower this number, the less amount of time between when you hit a key and when you hear a sound, or if you're recording something live in and monitoring it, how long it takes to actually come back out on the monitoring. This is controlled pretty heavily by your hardware setup. Some interfaces will allow you to adjust the latency. The trade-off can often be processing power. So if you lower your settings so the latency gets too low, it might not be able to keep up with a bunch of inputs or a bunch of outputs. So you may have to adjust this until it's comfortable and you're not having any audio errors. The test is just a test tone. You can use this for just making sure that you're getting audio out. So if you click it on, you can hear the tone. This adjusts the overall level. This adjusts your pitch. It can be useful also if you're trying to record into something and you just need to verify that you have actual output. And that just defaults to your standard master out. All right, moving on to the Link and MIDI tab. Link is a new feature that they've added that allows you to connect multiple instances of Live on different machines or different hardware. I believe there are some other programs that will also work with Link. One thing that's nice about it is you can tell it to sync the start clocks for all the things that are linked together. So when you press play in your version of Live, it means that someone else's version that you've linked up to will start at the same time and be running at the same point. So if, for instance, you have multiple computers and you're working in session mode, they will all be synced to the same clock, so you can pretty easily play together. The MIDI section is very important if you're trying to get any MIDI information in or out of Ableton Live. There's a few different parts to it. Control surfaces are special items of hardware that have been created to function with Live in a way that goes above and beyond standard MIDI. They can allow you to navigate around screens a little bit easier. They give you different functionality that can allow you to use Live a little bit more efficiently. And they vary in their integration with Live and how well they work. Right here is where you select the specific surface that you're using. And this is where you set where it's actually coming into your computer via MIDI. So if it were plugged into a MIDI in on my Motu, I would select that for input. And you also oftentimes want to set output, because a lot of those devices will have lights that light up in conjunction with what's going on in Ableton Live. So there's some visual feedback on your hardware to what's going on in the software. Takeover mode, there's a few ways of handling this. So, for instance, if you have a knob that's set to your volume and you turn that knob, you're not sure what number that is currently set to on the hardware. So either Ableton Live's parameter can pick up, meaning if you turn your knob past where it's currently set in Ableton Live, then it will start responding, but it won't move until you move it past the current value, or value scaling, which means that it will adjust it depending upon how different the current number is in Live and the current value is on your piece of hardware. Try playing around with these and see what feels more comfortable for you. Everybody has their own preference on that. Now we get down to our MIDI ports. As you can see, I have a few different options for MIDI in and out of my Ableton. This is one of the physical inputs onto my audio interface. Okay, you can see more details if you hit that down arrow, and it'll give you a lot of information. You probably won't have to touch any of this stuff unless you're messing around with MIDI sync. MIDI sync is an older way of trying to connect two computers or your computer to a piece of hardware and have it follow the Ableton clock. There's a few different options with how they sync. If you really want to get into that stuff, I'll have to make another lesson because it can be really annoying and complicated. So if you're interested, let me know, and I can dive into that on some later date. But most importantly, for each input into Live, you have a couple of options. You can have it receive sync information if it's an input, or send it if it's an output. The track selection means that you can send MIDI from something external to record it into Live. Don't confuse that with remote. Remote is saying that you want that input to be able to control Live parameters. So you need to understand the difference between recording into a new MIDI clip versus remote would be if I wanted to assign this knob to a MIDI So now I can assign it. If remote was turned off, I would not be able to assign MIDI to a piece of the live interface. The next section we'll look at is the file and folder section. This is really convenient, the save current set as default. If you decide that you want to build a template where every time you start a new live session, it looks a certain way or has certain inputs, is labeled a certain way, you can build a session, and then by clicking save in that session, it will make that your default opening live session. And if you just want to go back to the standard 2 MIDI 2 audio, you can hit the clear to go back to the default. Create analysis files creates a small file for every piece of audio that you load into Ableton. And that file just tells Ableton how to handle that audio. So if there's a clip or a sample that you use often, you don't have to reanalyze it every time you load it into Ableton. It will have already done that work and saved it. Sample editor, if you use a external program for editing samples, you can select that here. And it's easy to click on a piece of audio and tell it to just open it up in a sample editor and then save it right back to where it was. Temporary folder is just a location on your hard drive where Ableton saves new recordings before they have a session that they live in. Once a session is saved, it will keep all of your recordings for that session in a folder within that session. This is just a temporary spot if you start out with a new set and you haven't saved it into a session. Decoding cache is a section of your hard drive that you're just letting Ableton use for its own processes. You can set a minimum here as well as a maximum if you're afraid that you're going to overfill your hard drive. If you need to go and see what's in there, you can click the browse button and it'll take you right to it. Usually this doesn't get too big or cause too many problems, but if you have a small hard drive, you may want to set a maximum size just to make sure you don't overfill it. Plugin sources allows you to tell Ableton Live where you have your third-party VST plugins stored on your hard drive. The rescan button, you can use that to check if you've added a new plugin and it's not coming up over in the plugin section in Live. It will look at the folder again to make sure there's nothing new. Browse is where you set where that folder is. This can be confusing because a lot of times different plugin installers will put plugins in different places, so you may have to track them down on your hard drive. Also worth noting, now that Ableton Live is only 64-bit, it will not recognize 32-bit VST plugins. If you have some old ones that they've just never released a 64-bit version that you still want to use, you can go and download a specialized program called a wrapper that will allow you to run 32-bit plugins in a 64-bit Ableton. I've used JBridge. It works pretty well, but as with anything third-party, you can have errors, you can have crashes. It's been pretty stable for me in the past, but sometimes the way the plugins will work will be a little bit funky. It may not save your settings as you might hope it to. Use it with caution. Next, we'll move on to the library section. In the library section, you have your browser behavior. Collect files on export. What this means is if you save something from a live session, maybe it's a sampler that you've made, it will automatically copy the samples necessary for that instrument along with the actual settings for the instrument. If it's set to always. If it's set to never, it will leave those samples in their original folder, which could be trouble if you accidentally move that folder or delete it. You might have to track those samples down. Ask will just ask you if you want to copy them whenever you export something. And the show downloadable packs button. This section over here shows the Ableton Live released packs that you've downloaded. If this is set to on, it will show you what's available for update, what's installed, what you still can install. If you like using Ableton content, I would definitely leave that on. This just shows where those things are saved on your computer. You shouldn't need to alter this unless you need to move it to, say, another hard drive if you're trying to save space on your main hard drive, but most likely you probably won't need to adjust that. Now we'll go to the Record, Warp, and Launch tab. In the Record section, you can set your default file saving. So if you set it to WAV or AIF, that's the format that it will automatically save anything you record in. Bit depth, you can go from 16 to 32 bit. If you don't understand bit depth, it's the number of ones and zeros that determine the amplitude of a sound, which basically determines the dynamic range available to recording. Count in determines if you're using the metronome to record, if there's a count in, and how long it is. The exclusive section just sets if selecting the arm, which is the track record button, or the solo buttons are exclusive. So if they're enabled, what that means is if I hit solo, unless I tell it to listen to multiple tracks by holding control, it will only select one at a time. The same goes for arming a track. If you turn these off, it now allows you to select multiple solos or multiple armed tracks without holding control. Clip update rate is the rate at which Ableton will store changes that you make to a clip while it's recording into arrangement view. It also determines how soon you'll hear those changes if a clip is playing back. A 16th note is pretty fast. I think most people won't need to adjust this. Record session automation in armed tracks means that if you're recording automation, it will only record it into a track that's armed versus any track. This is probably useful for most people to keep on armed tracks only. You don't want to accidentally adjust the settings on another track while you're trying to overdub something on the one that you're focused on. Start playback with record just means that when you hit the record button up here, if this is set to on, it will start the transport when you hit this. If it's set to off, nothing happens until you hit play. Warps and fades. So this is the way that Live automatically deals with any audio that you bring in. So loop, warp, short samples. So if you bring in a drum hit or a short loop or something, my default is unwarped one shot. You can set it to a warped one shot, which means Ableton will analyze the file and the original tempo of it. Warped loop or auto, where you'll just allow Live to guess for itself. I like to leave auto warp long samples off. What that means is if you load in, say, a whole song, if you were to be DJing, or a really long audio file, for instance, if you have stems from a recording, most of the time you don't want it to automatically warp that file. You might want to do it manually or tell Ableton to do it when you want it to. Default warp mode selects which algorithm a new clip will use for time stretching and pitch shifting. Complex sounds the best generally, but texture, tones, and beats are all useful in different circumstances depending upon the audio content. Usually I'll leave it to complex. You can change it on the individual clip if you feel like that doesn't sound right. Create fades on clip edges. This basically automatically makes a very short fade in and fade out on any audio edit. The launch section just determines the way any new clip is set to launch. You have your different launch modes here and your default quantization here. Again, unless you know that you want to change these, you should leave it to trigger and global. Select on launch just tells Ableton, say I've got a clip here. I have this slot selected, but when I click play on that, it automatically selects that clip and brings it up down here. It's convenient for just keeping track of what you're doing as you're doing it. Select next scene on launch means that if you're launching scenes over here, when I launch this scene, it'll automatically go to the next scene. So if you hit enter, it'll just keep advancing through your scenes. Start recording on scene launch. I'll show you if we turn it on. If this track is armed, when I launch this scene, it will automatically start recording in that slot. So you can see it's recording a clip. Now, if I click on the next scene, it'll start recording a clip in that scene. If that's turned off, when you launch, it won't start recording anything. And tap tempo, you can start the playback with the tap tempo. The tap button is up here. So let's take this back to 0. So I'm just going to tap something in. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So when I got to the 4th beat, it automatically started playing back at the tempo that I just tapped in. If you turn it off, then it won't start it automatically. You can keep tapping as long as you want to try to get an accurate tempo tap up here. And the last section we're going to look at is license and maintenance. This just shows all of your license information. And if you want automatic updates, turn this on. It defaults to on. I like to turn it off because I don't like being surprised with new versions of things. And send usage data for if live crashes or whatever, you send information to Ableton and they figure out what went wrong and hopefully fix it in the next version. So that covers a lot of details on the preferences. Not super exciting, but it does allow you to really have some fine control over how Ableton functions for you. That's it for today. Please let me know if you have any questions about anything I've covered in this extra credit. If there's anything you'd like me to elaborate on more in the future, please subscribe to my channel and check out the rest of my lessons. Templar Thompson signing out.